talked about how Carnism uses a set of social and psychological defense mechanisms. The primary defense of Carnism is denial. If we deny there's a problem in the first place, then we don't have to do anything about it, right? And denial is expressed largely through invisibility. The main way that Carnism remains invisible is by remaining unnamed. If we don't name it, we can't even think about it. And then we can't question it, we can't challenge it. The invisibility of Carnism is why eating animals appears to just be a given. It's just the way things are, rather than a choice. Most people do not recognize that eating animals is, in fact, a choice. It's just what they've always done. And Carnism also keeps its victims out of sight and therefore conveniently out of public consciousness. Now, it's really important to point out that Carnism is an entire system of victimization. It victimizes all of us in different ways. Most of us here, everybody here, I'm sure, is aware of farmed animals as obviously the most direct and obvious victims of Carnism. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware that the environment is a victim of Carnism. Vegans are also victims of Carnism. We have to live in a world that every day offends our deepest sensibilities and deal with hostility and defensiveness and many other problems that we've already mentioned briefly. We'll talk about vegans a little bit later. But it's really important for us to acknowledge these two sets of victims of the system. Often we see meat eaters only as perpetrators and not as victims. But when we recognize that Carnism is invisible and that Carnism has effectively shaped meat eaters' choices, guided them like an invisible hand, so that people who eat animals make choices that are against their own interest and counter to their own values and harmful to their own bodies, then we can recognize that, to some degree, this is not a free choice that they are making. They're choosing to eat animals, but without awareness, there's no free choice. Victims of a system that has conditioned them to act against their own interests. And meat packers and slaughterhouse workers. Often in the United States, they're undocumented immigrants, non-English speaking immigrants. And I know around the world, even when they're not immigrants, these are people who have to work in a very highly dangerous, death-saturated environment and are deeply exploited. And most people do this job because they have no choice. And they end up traumatized from doing the job. I think personally that it's really important that we shine a spotlight on Carnism. It's very important, in my opinion, that vegans encourage meat eaters to recognize this system because often dominant systems maintain themselves by remaining unexamined. It's like there's vegans and vegetarians, and then there's everybody else. Now, invisibility alone is not enough to protect the entire system that's Carnism. And I mean, if you think about it, invisibility is not even foolproof. I mean, hints of the truth are surround us. There are dead animals everywhere we turn, right, in the form of meat. So when invisibility inevitably falters, Carnism needs a backup, a safety net. So we need to justify eating animals. And the way that people learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of meat are the facts of meat. Now, there's a vast mythology surrounding eating animals, but all of these myths fall under what I call the 3 ends of justification. If you had to guess what they are, what do you think they would be? Oh, that was fast. Natural? What else? Necessary? Nutritious, we'll come to that, but people always say nutritious. Close. Normal, natural, and necessary. You've heard this before, I'm guessing, right? And nutritious, I think of as falling under necessary, right? Necessary for health. I do this exercise. I'm on a speaking tour now, and I give a different presentation to meat-eating audiences, and I do this exercise with people with meat-eating audiences, and people always guess that so quickly. I say, what do you think the 3 N's would be? And I used to time them because I was fascinated by how quickly they guessed, and it was under 1 second once, so I stopped timing them. Everybody knows. Why do you think that everybody knows the answer to this? It's just logical because we've heard these same arguments so many times before. These same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history. For example, slavery, male dominance, heterosexual supremacy. We've heard this all before. So I want to just briefly, before we talk about advocacy, I want to briefly talk about these myths themselves, each of these myths. So eating meat is normal. Well, what we call normal is really just the beliefs and behaviors of the dominant culture, right? It's the carnistic norm. And carnism as a social norm is so entrenched that people are unable to see this as long as they are inside the carnistic box. So the example I like to use to explain this one is that most people would not condone, would not support, for example, killing a golden retriever who is perfectly healthy and 6 months old just because they like the way her thighs taste, even if she had a good life. Even if for 6 months she was able to run around and play and form friendships with other golden retrievers and some people, most people would say that's totally unacceptable. And yet many people today have no problem allowing the same thing to happen to somebody of a different species. Carnism as a social norm is so entrenched that it blinds people to the fact that humane meat, most people don't see this as a myth. A myth that was constructed by those in the business of violence to appeal to people who would ordinarily never support such violence. Well, how about eating meat is natural? This one is probably the most commonly, right? Have you heard this a lot? Yeah. It's natural. We've done this forever, right? Humans are supposed to eat animals. But what we call natural is just the dominant culture's interpretation of history. Right? It's not looking at human history, it's looking at carnistic history. For example, we don't refer to our fruit-eating ancestors. We refer to their flesh-eating descendants. In other words, we only look as far back in history as we need to justify current carnistic practices. And to be fair, murder, rape, and infanticide, killing infants, are arguably as long-standing and therefore as natural as eating animals. And yet we don't use the longevity of these practices as a justification for them today. As my friend and the author Colleen Patrick Goudreau says, do we really want to use the behavior of the Neanderthals as the yardstick by which to measure current moral choices? Can't we do better than that? And finally, eating meat is necessary. Well, what we call necessary is simply what is necessary to maintain the dominant culture. It's what's necessary to maintain the carnistic status quo, and that's all. And I will let a picture speak for itself, but I know in the back you may not be able to see all these numbers. This is the animal kill counter. This is the number of animals killed globally since I opened this page. Now, for the people who said eating meat is nutritious, you were probably referring to this, right? How many times have you been asked this question? Where do you get your protein? Well, everybody in this room knows that this is a myth. This has been proven by the medical establishment to be a myth, or at least significantly demonstrated to be a myth. For example, did you know that you could be strong enough to lift a car without having eaten an ounce of animal protein in your life? Really? Of course. You know, John F. Kennedy once said that belief in myths allows the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. JFK did not underestimate the power of myths, and neither should we. Even if we have stepped outside of the carnistic box, it's important that we recognize how powerful myths are. Because the myths of meat prevail despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And they prevail largely because carnism is so entrenched. It's embraced and maintained by all major social institutions, from the family to the state. It's become self-perpetuating. There's a quote that I like to use that gives an example of an entrenched system. It's from a 19th century French political economist. And he said, "When plunder becomes a way of life, we create for ourselves, in the course of time, a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it."